Hello everyone, and today we got a pretty hot topic to discuss. 6v6 is back, and with it, a 5v5 versus 6v6 war. I started playing just a year after release, and I play years of both formats. I can assure you my opinion is the only correct one, and you're wrong if you disagree. Of course I'm lying, and this is basically just to point out that people have different opinions, and not everyone is going to agree with you. So, before writing down in the comments, you're wrong, 5v5 is better, 6v6 is for the chats, or whatever, just keep it civil. Thank you. Lastly, I wanted to remind you that if you like the video, subscribe and leave a like to support me and my channel. I'm also doing coaching as a top 500 player, so if you're interested, send me a DM on the link in the description. No more self-promoting, let's begin. To start with, let's go over the original problems with 6v6 and why Blizzard ended up changing the format. Over Overwatch history, the tank role has been a rather problematic one. Support tends to be the one with the most controversy, especially in Overwatch 2, but tanks have shaped the meta in almost every moment, and have always been as mandatory to have as supports when open queue was the format. We had metas that were completely around them, like Double Shield or the original dive comps, which were tanks who would dominate games and had forced Blizzard to heavily nerf them or systems around them. Armor, shields, and evic etc. have been tuned back and forth a bunch of time during Overwatch's one lifetime. But why was that? Well, tanks in Overwatch are designed with strengths and weaknesses, like most heroes, but what happens when a tank covers for the other's weaknesses and vice versa, while sharing enough traits to build up a comp around them? Every meta in Overwatch history. Rain Zarya, T.Va Winston, Orisa Hog, Orisa Sigma, heck, even stuff like Zarya Hog was meta for some time, and I'm limiting myself to 2 tanks because before role queue, multiple tank metas with over 2 tanks have existed. Tank duos are a problem, or at least were, with a rather limited amount of heroes, and how basically one of them completely dominated the others for a period of time. Variety in the tank role was non-existent in most of Overwatch 1. Now, were they fun? Let's say Zarya Rein is meta for 6 months. Is it fun for the game? No, of course. Most players agree that Zarya Rein is a very healthy and fun duo to play with, as or against. Now, not every tank duo is Zarya Rein. The easiest example being Orisa Sigma. Double Shield was, in my opinion, the most unfun meta this game has ever dealt with. Goats lasted for longer, but at least was somewhat fun to play and wasn't present in lower heroes or casual play as much. Double Shield was everywhere and caused a ton of people to drop the game, as going from GOATs to this was quite disheartening for many players and their hopes of the balance team. Now, in regards to fun, after role queue at least, the tank role will suffer from being long term the least picked role by far, making queue times quite long for the other two and could very well cause hour-long queue time at its worst. 5v5 would try to be the solution to both these problems. A single tank will make it so, well, no more tank duos. So no more tank duos that dominate the game. The problem? Now solo tanks dominate the game. It turns out that when you buff tanks like crazy to compensate for the lack of a second one, naturally that player will have the highest impact in the game. This could be seen especially in early 5v5, with Zarya and D.Va in Season 1 making the game a pain in the ass for the rest. Season 2 with Hog and Orisa, and a huge etc. that to this day still really hurts the game. Although they made tanks over time more controllable for the rest of the team to deal with, they are still a central part of it. Now, that would be okay if tank suddenly was the most popular role or something. Being the raid boss of a team surely has to be fun, right? Wrong. Tank is still very unpopular, even more so when it's 6v6. Of course, not taking into account that now the game needs just half the amount of tank players to make games. Unfortunately, the reason why tanks aren't fun are pretty much integrated into this format. First, responsibility. Being the only tank forces the tank player to always play perfectly. Whenever you make a mistake or die, you most likely just gave up a point or straight up lost the game. This is especially true in casual and lower elos, where players just make more mistakes. Being blamed on the loss of a game, even if correct, will never feel good for anyone. At the same time, tanks, generally speaking, already had a ton of responsibilities. They need to create space, get kills, save allies, create opportunities, and so on. If a single player has to do this all at the same time, the burden will eventually affect your desire to play the role. Another huge problem with 5v5 has to do with older heroes. Remember when I said certain heroes have strengths and weaknesses? Well, in 5v5 both define what a tank can or can't do without the existence of another tank with different traits to make up for this. This deals into two problems. First, counter swapping. The most effective way to deal with an enemy tank as a tank player is to counterpick. So not only you will most likely not be allowed to play the tank you want, but you're also expected to learn every other tank counters. If you get counterpick and you don't swap, not only your experience will suffer but your team's, leading to the most common cause of flaming since Overwatch 2 came out. It also results in a single player having to deal with a billion negative effects and CC that can really slow your gameplay as a result. Getting naded, slept, CC'd into death is a common occurrence due to the enemy team being able to focus all of their resources on a single tank. The other issue, which I already mentioned, is the fact that you're very discouraged to main or one-trick a tank in Overwatch 2. Some may believe this is a good thing, but the reality of most players is that they just like a couple of heroes and want to dedicate as much time as possible to master them. Then we have off-tanks, the most effective heroes in the entire game with the change to 5v5. Most off-tanks were played as basically main tank supports that help them create space or cover some weaknesses. For example, Eva could Matrix a Winston entrance to deny burst damage and cover for Winston rather slow damage in Overwatch 1. Zarya would bubble a main tank to cleanse or prevent them getting CC'd or pushed back. This was the core fantasy on off-tanks, and with the sub they would adjust most of them to make them some poor man's main tank with awkward tools that usually tend to be very frustrating to players. With our prior examples, Zarya can now bubble herself or an ally twice, the idea being that she would need much more selfish bubbles to push and make space. The issue is that this ends up making her very frustrating as bubbles also got an increased duration and HP, stalling games and making non-interaction the viable strategy against her. In D.Va's case, her Matrix was turbo buffed with a similar idea, but this caused her to be incredibly hard to deal with for most hitscan and projectile heroes, while she does essentially nothing against beam ones, sharpening her matchups. This could have been solved with bigger reworks, but the truth is players who already enjoy these heroes didn't really ask for these changes, much less bigger ones that could fully change how they play. So, is 5v5 just bad all around? No, there are some positives about it that have made the game more fun for some people, especially non-tank players. First, individual value is higher. If you're good, you will almost always be able to do more in 5v5 than 6v6 on your own, which is something some players don't like to deal with. Teamplay is a core aspect of Overwatch, but in 6v6 it's true that it felt like teamplay was everything and solo outputs weren't as significant. This was especially true in the GOAT's double shield era. Another good thing about 5v5 is visual clarity. With two less heroes on a game, players can concentrate easily on what the other heroes are doing and what is active in the map. In Overwatch 1, stuff like this was somewhat common, to be honest. Then, we have a lot of things that have changed, but not necessarily for better or worse, as it depends a lot on who you ask about what they think. We saw a big reduction in fight duration, because killing with one fewer tanks tends to be easier, as you have more angles that aren't covered by a big mass of mid. This was a problem at the start of Overwatch 2, making supports pretty awful to play as, with Genji, Tracer and most dive heroes just making a massacre, but over time this got tuned to a much healthier state in my opinion. Another change that came with 5v5 is most maps, since they adjusted most of them to account for fewer players, offering more cover or high run access in most maps. This would be a positive, but the unfortunate truth about most Overwatch players is that they give zero fucks about cover and will sit right at the center of the fight if they could. It also offered more angles for snipers to play around, despite being specifically to lower their impact, since tanks are the only ones they can one-shot in the case of Widow and Hanzo for the most part. But now, 6v6 is back, and the game has evolved a ton since it got removed. Though the same problems stay, is 6v6 a perfect mode some make it up to be? Well, first I need to make clear that the current version is not role queue. it's open queue with 2 tanks limits, so there are no 3 or 4 tank comps to worry about. But tanks prove a problem even as duos. The thing is, with the release of so many tanks since Overwatch 2 came out, and some reworks like Dooms or Orisa staying, there is a ton more variety to choose from, and you can see it every time you queue. Yeah, there are more meta comps like Ramattra Zarya or Winston Diva and whatnot, but as of now, the dominance of a single tank duo doesn't seem to be a major issue. The balance team is also way more active nowadays, so metas never last for too long, and innovation can happen occasionally. Thankfully, all the tanks made in Overwatch 2 played quite well in 5v5, some even better. For queue times, well, if the mode eventually shifts to role queue, it would be hard to say, but as of now, most games do have 2 tanks, so I'm optimistic that it won't be a problem long term, as it seems many are interested in how tanks play in the current version of 6v6. I have to admit that at first I preferred to play as a tank in 5v5, but with time and adaptation from my end, I really enjoy the way most tanks play, especially the fact that I can't counter pick to such an extent here. Playing heroes like Diva or Junkie Queen whenever I want just feels the best. At the same time, when you aren't playing tank, you can feel like you have more options against some of them, as they have reduced HP and defensive outputs that could easily shut down entire kits, like the Diva example before. With all being said, this version also keeps most of the positive changes that were done during 5v5. Maps allow for more cover, letting non-tanks be able to not solely rely for the tank in open areas, while the stuff like heavy CC reduction and reworks over the years have made a positive impact on the experience. Heck, even tanks like Hog, Orisa and Mauga feel much better to go against and aren't as big as a problem as they could be in 5v5. Hog is able to play around his trap more freely without anchoring his team to weird positions, and then the other tank provide the defensive output they need. Orisa is more killable but provides some nice poke and CC support for the other poke tanks like Sigma, but she can't carry as much of her own. Mauga is a bit easier to deal with as it is more likely for 2 tanks to have some answer, so he doesn't go out of control, but he also likes the fact that he can have enough tanks to support his engages, making his pattern a lot more engaging overall. For supports, it's true that in some situations you might feel forced to heal bot, but it's not as big as a problem and tends to happen only where your team isn't approaching the fight correctly. That being said, supports are really strong since you can go 3 of them, or even 4, making Zenyatta plus 2 supports a very problematic comp to deal with. It isn't GOATS level since you can go 3 tanks, but there are some hints of it. It's possible that just Zen who needs a nerf, or maybe supports are just OP as a whole and should be tuned. The issue with that is that if it's open queue, it is more likely that you get non-support players, which could lead to the same issues that Overwatch launch. I believe role queue will be the better format for 6v6 in the long term, but the experimentation is neat. I also wanted to mention that thanks to the DPS passive, fights, while still tend to be longer than in 5v5, don't tend to drag as long as they did back in Overwatch 1, which is an improvement in my opinion. So what is the conclusion then? In my opinion, and thanks to all the work that the Overwatch team has done in the last years, 6v6 is an overall more enjoyable format, with a much better tank experience that doesn't completely centralize the game around them and lets the other heroes fulfill their roles. There are some good things in 5v5 and it's totally valid to prefer it. Heck, I am okay if they keep 5v5 as the main format, but I would also receive 6v6 with open arms if they decide to go with it. The uncertainty of queue times and whether or not they will be healthy for the game is most likely what would decide whether or not it's worth keeping, and I do believe that being a solid reason to keep 5v5 potentially. That's all everyone. Do you agree with my comparison between the modes? Do you prefer 5v5 or 6v6? I'll read you in the comments and see you next time.